Live, and my name is Kenzie Dodds. I am on this tech chat thing with Martin Staffa, and we're going to be talking about ngmodel. Just to preface this a little bit, or get kind of the purpose, I have a Patreon account, and one of the rewards is I do these tech chats. I have like 8 of them, and one of the rewards is for somebody or the person who's donating to be able to choose a topic that I talk about. And so Martin has been, or the person who donated, his name is Pascal Demilly. So thank you, Pascal. But he asked if I talk with somebody about ngmodel. And Martin has committed to the ngmodel file in Angular quite a bit, and so he knows a thing or two about ngmodel. And so, yeah, I think it's great that we have you on, Martin. Thanks for coming on to chat with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great.
Yeah. Okay, so just to get us started. Maybe could you give us an overview of what ngmodel is and its role in Angular?
Well, ngmodel is okay. Yeah. So ngmodel is basically it's the main way to bind an input. So the input, what you write in input, the text, and that is bound to the scope. So that's basically the core thing it does, but then again, it's also used in forms very heavily, and then you add a lot of stuff to it, like parsing and validation. So yeah, it does a lot of things, but at the core, it binds an input to the scope and vice versa. So it's two-way binding.
Okay, I think that was as a young programmer being introduced to Angular, that was what really impressed me when I first saw it. I was like, oh wow, like I type in here and it updates over here. Like that's so cool, that two-way binding. So what I guess there are a couple of things that ngmodel can do for us. Like let's take an example from a form, like a username, password, or something. Let's say that our username needs to be an email. How do we validate that that input is an email?
If you have, if you're using HTML5, or no, you don't even have to use HTML5, you can basically say, you can create an input, and if you give it to type email, then Angular will automatically add a validator based on that type that only validates or allows emails, like text input, that's an email. But you can also create your own directives that add validators to the ngmodel controller, which is the primary controller for ngmodel.
Cool. So there's the validators pipeline, and there's also like async validators. So you have these 2 different pipelines. Can you talk about those briefly?
Yeah, sure. The validators, it's basically an object, and you can add functions to it. And if the function returns true, then that is valid. And if it's not valid, then an error will be added to the ngmodel, and then you can react to the error in your templates. You can add classes or stuff like that. And the async validators is basically the same, only that you can or you should return a promise from it. So you can have you can ask the server if the state is correct, or I don't know, if a username is taken, for example, stuff like that. Yeah.
Cool. And in that case, the validator is resolved if it's valid and rejected if it's not, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Cool. So one common misconception that I see with people with async validators is they have the impression that you resolve it with true or false, but that's not, it doesn't actually matter what you resolve it with, right? As far as I understand that, nothing actually particular happens with what you resolve it with, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's probably because from a default validator, you return true or false, and then you think that you should resolve it true, but yeah, actually it's just resolving or rejecting them. That's right.
Yeah. Cool. So what? How do I? Since we're on this idea of validators, how do I hook into that validators pipeline to know whether or not a particular field is valid and show special styling or messages for when a field is valid for a particular reason, like email?
Yeah, it's actually the ngmodel directive. You have to use a form. Basically, you have to use ngmodel in the context of a form. So, and then you can access the form controller, because that's published to the scope, but not the ngmodel controller. And the form will have all the models that are as children, and then you can access the error object, and it will have all the errors that are currently on the model on it. Then you can say, yeah, I don't know, whatever you want, styling wise.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so and specifically, like, if I understand it correctly, you have to have a name on the form and a name on the ngModel element for that to be published. So you have a name on the ngModel element to have it published to the form, and then a name on the form to have it published to the scope. Is that right, or am I misunderstanding that?
No, that's actually absolutely correct. Yeah, that's it is something you have to know. Otherwise, yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I was actually thinking it would be pretty trivial to write a directive that you tack on to the ngModel element to have that controller published to the scope. So if anybody wanted to create a directive, it'd probably just be like no more than 10 lines of code total or less even, to be able to say, hey, I want to publish this ngModel on my scope, and here's the name that I want it to have. Yeah, that would probably be pretty easy. Fun exercise if anybody's interested in doing that.
Yeah.
Cool. So then it also sets different classes. Can you talk about the classes that it sets on the element based on validation?
Well, yeah. Basically, you have the wow. It does. You don't have ng error, I think. I'm not actually completely sure what the classes are, but there's like the class for every error, and ng invalid if there's an error, ng valid if there's no error. So basically, all the states are reflected with classes if the state is currently on the model or if the state is currently not on the model. So you can react to all the states, and you can react to absence of errors that way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed in some people's code, that they'll have like a ng class to add a class if the ngModel is valid or invalid. And I think some people don't realize that Angular actually does this for you with the ng valid, ng invalid as classes. And then you can just style that component however you like. So can you talk about those different states that you were mentioning? I think you were talking about ng touched
yeah, right. At the beginning, like the control is pristine, which means there's like no input, and it hasn't been there's never been an input. So, and as soon as you enter something in the control or the input, it becomes dirty, and then it stays dirty. So until the element is destroyed or something. And when you blur the element, it gets the touched state. So in the beginning, it's untouched. It's a little bit confusing because touched is can be misunderstood, but it actually happens when you blur the input. And then what else is there? I think we recently in 1.5 we added another one. It's empty, so that's added when the control is completely empty. And then there's of course the error states, And then you have pending. I think pending is when there's an async validator that's not yet resolved or rejected, then you get that. So you can do some styling there, like a loading spinner or something like that.
Cool. And all of these different states are available both as classes on the element as well as on the ngModel controller itself. And so once you get a handle on that controller, whether you do it with that special directive that somebody should write, or by having it nested inside of a form and giving that form a name and that ngModel a name, and then using that, once you get a handle on that ngModel controller, you have access to the errors under $error, and then you have the $validators, $async validators, $pristine, $dirty. Like all of these are just $properties. Is there anything else that I missed, or any other properties that are interesting on that controller?
Well, there's the other ones like pristine and dirty. Yeah, but I think you like for the general use, yeah, these are the ones that you're interested in.
Yeah, I recommend, as a good thought experiment, somebody should just go, or if you're curious, just go and write a quick directive that requires ngModel, and then just console out all the object.keys on the ngModel to see what's available. There are plenty of helpful things. And actually, if you look at the Angular formally examples at the bottom of pretty much all examples, it does a pre-tag with the form piped through JSON, so it's just like the JSON, and that will show you an ngModel as well. It'll also show you the ngForm controller as well. So recommend, if you're curious, you can check that out. So we talked about the email, but there are a bunch of other different input types and yeah, like automatic validators that Angular does. Let's say I wanted to create my own. So like you have text, and you have checkbox, radio, number, email. I'm looking at the docs right now. I don't have this off the top of my head. Yeah. And like date, time, local, time, month, and week, all for input. But if I had a custom input type, like IP address, how would I go about creating a validator for that? And I should actually note, some people watching this may be familiar with Angular formally, and creating a validator for Angular formally is different. And it's Angular formally kind of abstracts this away to make it a little simpler. But I think it's valuable for us all to understand our abstractions. So yeah, so how would I add or write a directive? What are the things that I need for my directive to add a custom validator?
So what you would do is you would create a directive that goes on the ngModel element, and then the directive would require the ngModel controller, and then you would access it and add a validator to the validators object, which then does your, I don't know, it can read from the attributes, like if you have something that's customizable or something like that, and then that's the main thing. I mean, if you want to use a special type that doesn't exist in HTML5, then you have to check for that type, because directives can't be matched by type. So you'd always need another attribute for that.
And that's one nice thing about Angular too, is it's now we have selectors for our components, so the directives technically could be matched by type in the future version of Angular, which is nice.
Cool.
So specifically, when you say you need to require the ngModel, on that you have your directive definition object, which is really complex. Lots of people don't understand. But you, as a property on that, you say require ngModel, and then in your link function, that takes the scope, the element, the attributes, and then the controller that you've specified. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Cool. And then you can actually specify multiple controllers, right? And then I think that last parameter would be an array of those controllers. Is that what you understand?
Yeah. if you have, like, for example, if you need a form controller, then the last argument would be an array. And whichever you required first comes first in the array too.
Cool. Yeah, definitely something to look into. Writing custom directives for functionality, to add functionality to these controllers is actually really handy. So I recommend people check that out. Okay, so let's talk about animation really quick. So let's say my input starts out as valid, so it's a valid email, and then somebody starts typing, and the moment they start typing, it's no longer valid, right? It needs to have a couple extra characters for an email. And so it goes from pristine to dirty, it goes from valid to invalid. Is there, what can I do with Angular, or do you know, I guess this might not be very fair because I don't know how familiar you are with the Angular animate, but
Yeah.
you know if there are hooks given to us with Angular animate to animate these things?
The state changes here, they definitely can be animated. I think it's basically behaves like an ng class animation, but I have to admit I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, but yeah, there are definitely animation hooks in there.
Cool. And then similarly, or like in the same scenario, I may want to like make the input glow red or something, but then I also want to show messages. Can you talk about ngmessages at all? I know this is kind of going a little bit beyond ngmodel, like I told you.
But yeah, ngmessages is basically, it's like a complementary directive to ngmodel, because as you know, the dollar arrow property is an object, and with ngmessages you can simplify the displaying of error messages. So basically, the ngmessages directive takes like a map of properties as an input, and then you can, as children, you can have the ngmessage directive, and then you can display like your own message for every key and the object in your ngmessages, or in that case the dollar arrow object. Yeah, it's easier than it sounds.
Yeah, I agree with you. It actually, like, if anybody tried to do messaging before ngmessages, that was a real pain. So ngmessages was really nice.
Yeah.
Is there
the good advantage? Sorry.
Like
go ahead. The biggest advantage of using ngmessages is basically that you don't have to have lots of ngifs in your code or ng-shows. So that's what ngmessages makes. It makes a lot easier than before.
Cool. So is there anything like specific in the code of ngmodel that like is special to ngmessages, or are they totally isolated from each other?
No, actually, ngmessages simply takes an object or an array as an input, and that can be anything, but it's I think it's mainly used with the error object in the ngmodel. Cool.
So yeah, I think that's an important point. If for some reason if ngmessages isn't working for you, there's nothing special about ngmessages and ngmodel. You can make your own ngmessages if you need to for like whatever use case you have. But definitely learn about ngmessages first, because it probably will do what you want it to do. So awesome. So let's talk about ngmodel options really quick. What are ngmodel options and why do we have them? Or like what purpose does ngmodel options serve?
ngmodel options, it's what it says, it's options for ngmodel, so you can customize a certain behavior, and the biggest thing is that you can customize when your input updates the model, so to say, or basically when a change in the input actually triggers the whole ngmodel pipeline with validators and parsers. So the best example is probably Debounce. So when somebody types in an input, and for example, you have an email, and the example is you type one letter, and normally that would make the ngmodel would say, oh, that's not an email, it's just one letter. So it would display all sorts of errors and stuff, and you probably don't want that. So with ngmodel options, you can say debounce that change, and then you would have like, it would only propagate the change after you have stopped writing, like 5 seconds, or no, that's not a good example, like 1 second after you stopped writing, and then it would update the ngmodel.
Cool. I have a couple of egghead lessons on ngmodel options if anybody's interested in checking them out. One thing that I want to make sure that I mentioned before, because I failed to cover this in that lesson, and I actually gave a talk on at ngconf on ngmodel options as well, but I think I failed to mention this there also. But you can have defaults on the ng forms, or on the form. So you can put ngmodel options on the form, and then that will default to all of the fields in your inside of that form, which is kind of handy. So if you want them all to be debounced or something. So a couple of the properties that you have with ngmodel options is getter setter, UpdateOn, Debounce, Timezone, I think, and I feel like there's another one. But can you talk about what getter setter is and why that's valuable? What a good use case for that would be?
Getter setter is a way to say, instead of having just a property on the scope that gets updated with the model, you can actually define a setter function, and that will be called instead of that will be called with the value that is supposed to become the ngmodel, and then you can actually process that or set a different value on the scope. And the same is true with the getter. If you have a getter function, that will be called when the model on the scope changes. But actually, for an example, I'd have to think about it. What's a good example? I've never used it personally. Maybe you have a good example.
I have a use case for it in my app, but I can't remember what it was. But if you look at the example on the website, I think it must have been Brian Ford who wrote this, because he's using the name Brian. But basically, he's using it to store some local variable, inside of his controller, rather than having it bound actually like to that local variable. So you could also do maybe like a transform or something. But I think this in some ways could be used instead of like parsers and formatters potentially. And that's actually one other thing that we didn't cover. So I'll make a note of that, so we make sure to talk about parsers and formatters. But yeah, I haven't used getter setter a whole lot. Just on occasion I'll need it. I can't remember a specific use case I had for it. What about UpdateOn and Debounce? Those you talked about Debounce already, but UpdateOn and Debounce kind of relate to each other.
Yeah, like Debounce, we already had that, and UpdateOn is you can basically define the events that you want to trigger a model update. So, for example, you could say UpdateOn blur, and then the model would only update if you actually blur the control. So a lot of people like that. So only, for example, only errors are displayed if you have blurred the input. So if somebody focuses an input and leaves it empty, and then you want to display the error, you only want to display it if the control is blurred. So and then you can also use, I think, change, and yeah, you can also use other events. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's also default, which is a non-event, but it's basically the default behavior, which is some fancy magic from Angular.
Yeah.
Cool. And then with Debounce, you can set that to be either an integer that's milliseconds after the users stop typing, or you can set it to an object with the keys being the type and like the event, and the values being an integer. So like that will only like it will do the default only after 500 milliseconds, but it'll do blur immediately. It'll update immediately or something like that. So, which is I think really handy, especially for that email example that you were talking about. So you don't display any errors or anything. You don't update the model until after they've either finished typing or they blurred the input. So, and I think that's the example that I use in my egghead lesson. Cool. And then Timezone, I still can't think of a really super use case for Timezone, but can you talk about what that does?
Well, actually, it only refers to like the dates stuff, like input types that are date. But honestly, I can't really tell you what exactly it does. I think you can specify from the name of it, you should be able to specify the time zone that's used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But, yeah, like I said, I haven't really found it terribly useful. I think originally it only worked with UTC, but I think it now works with a lot more time zones. But yeah, the basic behavior is the model value will be in one time zone and the view value will be in another, I think. So I'm not sure of a good use case for that, but it's there, I guess.
Yeah, like so many things.
Yeah, cool. So let's see, there was also parsers and formatters I wanted to talk about. Can you mention what those are and why we have them?
Yeah, like parsers are and formatters are ways to transform the model or the view value. Basically, when you change, when you type in the input, then the parsers are called. Parsers also is an array that you can access in the ngmodel controller. You can add functions to it, and basically they transform the input value to the model value. And formatters do the same, but they only do it when the model is changed on the scope, and then they basically transform the value. So they transform it to the input value. And in the core, it's used in some, for example, in the number input type, we have a parser that parses the input to a number type, a real JavaScript number. But you can do all sorts of things if you want to transform your input values, parse the input values.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Parsers and formatters are pretty helpful, and they're likely used in several of the libraries that you're using for form controls, because they're handy for stuff like date inputs and things like that. Cool. So there's also on the ngmodel controller, there are several methods that we can call and to control the ngmodel a little bit, like directly. So if we had our own custom directive that used ngmodel, so can you talk about some of those, what some of those methods are, and like maybe I'll just ask specifically some of the ones to set the state of the ngmodel, like pristine and dirty and touched and things. What are the purpose of some of those methods, and what are some of the things that we can do with ngmodel?
So basically, these methods are exposed on the model controller because sometimes you have, for example, you have and normally in Angular you process the form on the client and you just send it like a JSON representation or something to the server. But for example, if you send a whole form to the server and then you get a response, with that you want to like manually call set dirty or something, or you can also set the validity of an object, of a field, of a input based on some state you obtained from the server. And that's why we exposed all these methods. And these are the same methods that are used internally. So it's simply a way to give you the option to do that manually if you need to. So just more power to you, basically.
Cool. Okay, I have a couple of questions about specifics of these. So one is $render, and then rollback view value and set view value, and commit view value. So if you want to start with I don't know which one makes most sense. I think they all kind of flow into a pipeline together, if I understand it right.
Yeah, actually, render is that's what's the last thing that's called when the model changes on the scope. So if the model changes in the scope, the formatters are called, the model is rendered, and then it is validated. So that's only called in that specific case. And about set view value, that's actually called in the exact opposite case. That's called when the input changes, and then a set view value on the model is called with the value that's currently in the input. And that again triggers the whole, it triggers parsing, validation, and then in the end, the update to the model. So it's a very powerful method, but normally you don't really have to use it, because it should only ever be called with the same value that's currently in the input anyway.
Cool. And then with the rollback view value and what was the other one? Rollback view value and commit view value. What are those two for?
Yeah, these are basically commit view value. That's only called if you don't have anything that debounces the model update. So that's basically if you have 500 milliseconds debounce, then at the end of this debounce, commit view value is called. So it's like an intermediate step, and normally I don't think you would have any need to call that. Same is, I think, true for rollback view value. Yeah, I've never used that, but it's also like it's used to. I think it's used to abort like an update that happens inside of Debounce, or no, I actually don't know.
Yeah, I've never used it either. So anybody watching probably won't really have need to use either one of those. Yeah. There's also validate, which validate kind of, it's obvious what that one does. And occasionally that's useful if your validator depends on two fields and you update one, you want to validate the other, you can call validate to make sure validation runs again. And then you have these different properties. So we didn't talk about view value. Can you talk about the difference between view value and model value?
So the view value is the value that gets passed from an input to the ngmodel, and the model value is the value after the parsers have run. So and that's also, the model value is also the value that gets then set on the scope. So it's basically before and after, so to say.
And then is the view value what the user sees after the formatters have run as well?
Yeah, that's right. So basically the view value should always, or is always, the value that you can actually see in an input, if it's just a string, that is.
Okay, cool. And then on this ngModel controller, we also have parsers and formatters and validators and async validators for these different pipelines. But here's one that I've never used, but I think I should. The view value or the view change listeners. Can you talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah, the view change listeners. That's the name is a bit misleading because it's not called when the view changes. It's called after the model is updated on the scope. So if you want to react on a scope change, then you can you can add a function to the view change listeners. I think it's an array. And if you know the ng change directive, basically what the ng change directive does is simply it adds a function to the view change listeners and then executes it. So, but you can also access the view change listeners directly in a directive that requires ngmodel controller.
Okay, cool. So I actually am using view change listeners, even though I don't know it.
Yeah.
Nice. Cool. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. I had one personal question. In my app recently, we had a use case where the backend, or we have a time input, and the backend wants to have that formatted like the hour, minute. And with Angular, it adds parsers and formatters for an input of time to change it into a date. So our solution was just to like totally clear out parsers and formatters in our own custom directive, just like deletes those. Is there a better way to have done that you can think of off the top of your head? Like would it be better to create our own parsers and formatters that like switches it back, or would there be a better way to handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think if you of course you could parse it again to a string, but then the validators would have I think they would have a problem validating it. So I think what you did is basically
it worked great. So
if it works, it's great. Yeah. Or you could maybe you could even use the setter to reformat it from a date to a string.
Yeah, that might have been. Yeah, that might have worked. Getter setter. Maybe I'll look at that again. Maybe not. It's working, so cool. I think that was all the questions that I had. I probably should have let people who are watching ask questions. There is a Q&A app on Hangouts, and so if you're watching in Hangouts, not on YouTube, but in Hangouts, you can open up the Q&A app, and it looks like somebody asked a question just now. Sweet. Okay, so here's a question from Caleb Kniffen, who is actually one of my Angular Formally friends. He's really, really helpful, so thank you, Caleb. And I hope I said your last name right. But his question is, what is the recommended way for handling validation for ng models with nglist? Nglist is one thing I'm not familiar with, but maybe you are?
nglist is basically a directive that allows you to enter comma-separated values, and then what comes out on the scope is an array of these values. So
okay, cool.
It's basically type email with multiple. That's a good question, because at the moment the validation support is not really there for nglist. So what you would need to do is probably write your own directive that adds a validator that can handle arrays, which is obviously not ideal. So for 1.5, we'll actually finally want to make this happen, that nglist supports validation. So that's the plan for 1.5. In the meantime, you have to do a custom directive, I think.
Cool. Still much code to be written.
Yeah, but the good thing is that like the validators in Angular, they're pretty tiny. So the code that's used there is pretty tiny. I mean, and it's pretty easy to take like the regex, for example, for email, and use it in your own directive. So ngmodel can be a bit complex when you look at the source, but the validators are they're easy to understand. So you can just take what you need.
Yeah, and don't let the sheer size of the file scare you. Most of it's documentation. So cool. I had another shoot. Oh yeah. So if anybody's watching live right now on Hangouts, I'll leave the Q&A app open, but I think we're going to wrap up. But I wanted to mention a little bit of the differences about Angular formally and how it simplifies some of this for you. So Angular formally makes it easier, I think, to reuse forms and reuse field configurations and yeah, keep your code a little bit more dry. And so it has abstractions on top of like all of these different things. So you have ngModel options with the model options property. You have lots of these custom validators or you can provide custom validators with the validators property and the async validators property. You can provide parsers and formatters with the parsers and formatters properties. And all of these things, or most of these things, Angular formally just kind of passes on to ngModel. So it's actually Angular formally, lots of the magic is actually coming from Angular, and Angular formally just acts as an abstraction that sits on top of Angular's ngModel and passes things along. And so like some of the things that Angular formally does that are kind of helpful is like with the ngModel, if you want to get a hold of the controller, you have to provide a name on the ngModel element as well as on the form, and then you reference the ngModel from that. But Angular formally just kind of gives that to you. You don't have to think about creating a unique ID or name or anything like that. And so, yeah, that I guess, yeah, if you're serious about forms in your application, then I recommend you take a look at Angular formally. You know, it's kind of a self-plug, but it's been really helpful for me and a lot of other people. But in the end, it's all just using ngModel and ngform. And so, yeah, I think that was probably everything. That's all the questions that I had. And hopefully, Pascal, this is helpful for you. So thank you for donating to the cause on Patreon. And yeah, thank you, Martin, for coming on. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about ngModel or?
Yeah, let me just mention one thing that's that we had with ngModel options, and I think what you forgot was allow invalid. This is the last option that's on ngModel options. That is interesting because what normally happens is if your input is invalid, then Angular will never update the model on the scope. So that can be confusing if you're starting out, and that's why we introduced this ngModel option that's called allow invalid, and that simply does that. Even if a validator failed, if there's an error on the model, it will be updated on the scope. So yeah, that's really helpful.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that one up. That one's good. It's good for like email. You know, it's a good example where that could be useful. Or yeah. Cool. So if somebody wants to get involved with contributing to ngModel or contributing to Angular in general, what's the best thing that they can do to get involved with that?
Well, we are always, you know, open to pull requests for, especially I think if you're starting, if you have a doc improvement, they're always very welcome because something that's like simple for the core developers might not be so simply described. So if you want to change that, and yeah, you can also open like a feature request on the GitHub issues, and then we will think about it. The thing with ngModel is that it's very complex. It's a very complex thing, and we don't necessarily want to make it too complex. So it's always great to see, you know, Angular formally, and other directives that basically build on top of ngModel and make it even more powerful.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all your work on ngModel, and thanks for coming on to chat with me about it. I think this has been helpful, and hopefully people will watch it later and find use out of it in the future. So thanks, Martin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see. I'll stop the broadcast.